Well, hi folks. Thanks for joining in. This is Cross Lights, where we're re-examining the end times. My name is Marc Paladino, and we've been discussing some of the issues relating to eschatology and the return of Jesus, and some other issues through the lens of my book, The Threshold of Exile, which was published last fall, which would be fall 2024. Want to say something about this, not in my defense, but just for the sake of some people who, well, let's say occasionally I get a kind comment by someone that mentions that my theology, if you will, is based on just a pick and choose kind of verse here and a verse there. That doesn't bother me. But for the sake of anyone who might want to go that way or make that kind of argument, I'd just like to point out, just in this book alone, I have 879 New Testament references and 272 Old Testament references, which is a total of about 1,151 scripture reference. That's not individual verses, by the way. That's context, where 3, 4, 5, 6 or more verses are offered. That does not even include the inline references. So you probably have somewhere near in the vicinity of about 1,200 biblical references in a 400-page book. So just for the sake of those who might think that this is sort of a cherry-picking event in terms of my eschatology, I just want to assure you, for your own sake, I don't care. I really don't. I don't worry about it. I know what I believe and the research that I've done, and I also trust many of the scholars that I have studied that have helped me in my direction. So please, before you make comments like that, think through, look at the book, and see if that bears out. So anyway, enough of that said. We're kind of in the middle of this Olivet Discourse at this point. This is episode 22. And we have been discussing, and at this stage in the discourse, in the middle of this discourse, the coming of Jesus, what scholars refer to as the parousia. That's the Greek word that's translated coming or arrival or presence. And I want to point out that we mentioned in episode 19 that it appears in three points in this discourse, and I think the more I read it, the more I understand its importance. Not so much just understanding the Greek definition, which is important. It has to do with coming, arrival, presence. In previous times, it might have referred to the arrival of a king, and so it's the word that's used in this Olivet Discourse in Matthew that first reappears in verse 2 and 3 of Matthew 24, where the disciples ask, when will be the signs of your coming, your parousia, your arrival, and the end of the age. Then we find it also in verse 26 to 28. Verse 27 says that as the lightning comes from the east and west to the west, then so will be the coming or parousia of the Son of Man. And then finally, as it was in the days of Noah, in verse 37, so will be the coming or parousia of the Son of Man. What we see what I began to see in this use of this word, that it helps us to shape the discourse itself, and it also helps us that this is not just a fun fact that you can stick in your notebook and say, hey, well, this word shows up 3 times in Matthew 24. Well, yes, that's it, but it actually establishes a continuity in the narrative, which is very important in interpreting the verses, because there's a lot of weird and strange descriptions going on here in terms of what Jesus is doing, what's happening, what the tribulation is, and the Son of Man coming in clouds and showing up in the Ancient of Days, and the explanations of these things can be timeless. We're able to explain them to a point, but the descriptions that were given in these texts are culture bound. They belong to a different age, a different manner of speech that's used, and we've gone over this to how the Bible uses some of this type of cosmic imagery to describe things. And so we have to bear in mind we're reading an ancient text. We're reading a text that was written thousands of years ago, and their manner of expression was quite different than ours. Now, we learned last time that in Matthew 24:29 that we said that immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun would be darkened, the moon would not give its light, the stars would fall from the heaven, and the powers of the heavens would be shaken. And this text, of course, falls within the context that ends at verse 34, where Jesus said all these things will come upon this generation. And so this kind of decreation is what David Chilton called it in his book, The Days of Vengeance, his commentary on Revelation. It is the imagery of cosmic collapse, okay? And this is very common in prophetic language, as we have learned. And so this speaks of the dissolution of the existing creation. You know, the rule of Babylon was seen as a creation. The rule of Assyria is seen as a creation. These are all elements of a certain creation, a certain time, a certain framework of the fabric of the universe, in a sense, you know, in the civilized world. And so when these orders, great orders, fell, collapsed, if you will, it would be seen as a cosmic collapse, as kind of because the rulers were seen as stars, the laws, the rulers, the economies, these were seen as suns and moons and stars of governing lights over the world. Now we learn also that as we come to verse 30, we also discover that Jesus says then he starts with the word then, okay, and then is the first word of the text, where he says, "Then will appear the sign of the Son of Man." Now we suggested to you last time that this is not a visible sign in the sky, and actually I've done a little study on this word then, ote in the Greek. It's pronounced, or tote is pronounced in the Greek, and according to Vines, actually it speaks of. Basically, it means at that time. Now, it's translated then, the vast majority of its occurrences in the New Testament, but it actually means at that time. And so what Jesus is saying, at that time of this cosmic collapse, at this time of decreation, something's going to happen, okay? And it's all going to be in relationship to the Son of Man, what Jesus is describing about himself, okay? The Son of Man and his coming, or his arrival. And he tells us in verse 20, chapter 24, verse 30, first half, it says, well, let's just use that phrase, at that time, the Son of Man will appear, the Son of Man, or the sign of the Son of Man. And we said this is not a visible sign in the sky. But in Daniel 7, we learn that this was that his appearance before the Ancient of Days. Okay, Daniel saw one like the Son of Man, and he came up to the Ancient of Days. And so what Jesus is describing here is not his coming to earth per se, to stand on the earth, but he's coming to appear before the Ancient of Days, and there we learn from Daniel 7 that he is given the kingdom. But it's interesting because it tells us in Daniel 7, well, I should probably just read it for you just to make sure that we're all on board with it. Daniel, if you have a Bible handy, you can turn to Daniel 7, and let me a moment to get it here for you. Daniel 7 is a very critical chapter. The book of Daniel as a whole is a very critical chapter in terms of understanding Jesus' arrival, Jesus' coming. He says that I saw in the night vision, this is verse 13, and behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like the Son of Man, and he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. So when we read in Matthew 24 that then will appear the sign of the Son of Man, we're not looking at something that's going to appear before humanity. He's appearing before the Ancient of Days, just like if you and I did something wrong and we had to appear before a judge, okay? It's not something that humanity is seeing. The sign is something that's actually occurring in the heavens. Now, you might ask, what kind of sign is it if we can't see it? Well, that's a good question, very good question. But I would also have to turn your attention to Matthew chapter 12 and verses 38 to 40, where Jesus tells the scribes and the Pharisees that no sign will be given to you except the sign of Jonah. For just as Jonah was in the belly of the whale for 3 days and nights, so will the Son of Man will be in the heart of the earth. Well, nobody saw that sign. Nobody saw Jesus, but it was still considered a sign. Now, to the degree that we can understand that, but it makes sense to the fact that even though humanity was not given the privilege of actually seeing the Son of Man before the Ancient of Days, he still appeared there, and that was to be understood as a sign. Now, so there he's given dominion, and as was also the church. So as we continue in Daniel 14, let's go back and just finish that for a minute while we're here in Daniel. He says that it was, and to him was given dominion, the glory and the kingdom, that all people, nations, and languages should serve him. And his dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom is one that shall not be destroyed. And then as we go down to verse 27, he says, and the kingdom and the dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven shall be given to the people of the saints of the Most High. So here we're not only seeing that Jesus goes and obtains the kingdom from the Father, is presented the kingdom, but it's also now distributed to the saints of the Most High. Now, where do we see this? Where do we see this? If we turn in our Bibles to Matthew 21, we see an interesting sequence here. We see the arrangement of how this actually occurs, and this ties right into what Jesus is trying to tell his disciples. And he gets into this parable of 21, the parable of the tenants. And for the interest of time, we're not going to be able to read all of it. But I just want you to see the sequence here, or the arrangements, that to see how the king comes, he destroys, and reassigns kingdom stewardship. And so in verse 40 we read, when the owner of the vineyard comes, what will he do to those tenants? They said to him, he will put those wretches to a miserable death and let out the vineyards to other tenants who will give him fruits in their seasons. And then Jesus goes on to say in verse 43, therefore I tell you, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a people producing its fruits. And he's talking, of course, to a Jewish audience. So what we see is that the Son of Man comes, okay, he's going to bring destruction, and then there is a reassignment of the kingdom stewardship to the church, okay? So now, let's look farther into this idea of Jesus destroying his enemies, and this is the second half of the text. He says, at that time, he says then, so so at that time, so this is all kind of in a concurrent situation here. The stars falling and this cosmic collapse is being described in relationship to the Son of Man, who first we see going into to appear before the Father. The kingdom is given to him, and the judgment is passed in favor of the saints who receive the kingdom. And then it says to us at that same time, that all the tribes of the earth, not the earth, it's the land, the tribes of the the tribes of the land, there's 12 times the tribes of Israel, right? Then the tribes of the land will mourn. Why will they mourn? Because they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. Again, is this something they will see? Or the idea here is the fact that they will witness the Son of Man coming in clouds of glory. This coming in clouds of heaven is again something that's very descriptive, based on Old Testament language. You know, God came on a cloud to Egypt. We've seen this several times in Isaiah 19:1. The Lord is coming on a cloud, about to come to Egypt. I doubt anyone saw him physically, okay? But they will witness this, and what is visible to those who are mourning and crying is the fall of Jerusalem and the power structures of the old age. What actually is occurring, what can't be seen, is Jesus coming in clouds of glory. Now, how is that, again, played out? Let's stick with our parables in Matthew 22, because going back to Matthew 22 let's see how Jesus describes this event in a parable in Matthew 22 and verse, let's call it verse 7 is what we want to give our attention to. He talks about the parable of the wedding feast, and those who were his enemies took and killed his servants and treated them shamefully. And then in verse 7 it says, and the king was angry. He sent his troops and destroyed those murderers and burned their city. And then he says to his servants, the wedding feast is ready, but those invited were not worthy. Go into the main roads and gather them in. So what we see here is that this arrival, this coming and this destruction is seen in the agency of the Roman army. See, and that's what often is referred to as God coming in clouds. The clouds would be the presence of an army. Okay, God is hidden from sight. He's the Lord of hosts. He's hidden from sight, but his agent, the agent of his coming or his presence or his arrival in coming in judgment in this way is this army. That's how it's played out. And we already saw some time back in Psalm 22, in 2 Samuel 22, we read that God in his salvation of David, when he came and simply just to destroy the Saul and David's enemies, it says that he was seen on the wings of the wind. Okay, well, again, did anybody actually see God coming in this cloud on the wings of the wind in David's day? I doubt it. Okay, it's just his appearance. Okay, and David even later on in that text talks about the armies. About armies. So these things are descriptions of not God coming visibly and saying, hi, here I am, it's the end of the world, or he's landing on the ground. He's simply using the same kind of descriptive language that historically was used by people in that era, in the biblical era. This is common, what we call linguistic convention, common style of speech, okay, about God coming into a situation, bringing judgment. They talk about him being seen. They talk about him coming in clouds. They talk about, but it inevitably has to do with an army. And Jesus' parables, let me point this out. This is not just my opinion. Jesus' parables bear that out. Okay? He says, he sends his army, okay, to destroy the city. So this mourning that we see in Matthew 24, the Son of Man coming in clouds of glory, and this great mourning going on has to do with the city, the temple being destroyed. Okay. Now, moving on, in Matthew 24, we probably we'll have to talk more about that as time goes on, but we'll see if we can, Revelation's going to help us, and just further discussion is going to help us. And I understand, folks, that this is not easy to get your head around sometimes. I mean, let me say this, without being critical of any brother or sister or person or church or theological center, I believe that there is a futurist stronghold in the church. I just believe that we have given ourselves over to a futurist mentality, that none of these things could possibly have happened in the first century, so it must have to do with some things yet to happen at the end of the world, and we're looking for some kind of literal events. But again, I remind you, nowhere in the Bible is this image of cosmic collapse, stars falling, moon turning to blood, stars darkening, falling from heaven, sun not giving its light, God coming on a cloud. Nowhere, anywhere in the Bible is that ever referred to, especially in the Old Testament prophets, as an end of the physical universe. Okay? It's just not. It is a style of speech that is consistent with prophetic language, and Jesus is using it, and it's a style of speech fully comprehensible to his first audience. And like I said, we're trying to interpret this thing through a 20 or 21st century lens, but the language is culture bound. The language is something out of history. And I've got some research, and I'm going to find that for you maybe in our next episode, where even in this day, in recent history, you can go to small islands, in the Pacific or in the Atlantic or wherever, and find tribes and cultures who use very strange descriptions of things in their communications. All right, and so these things are just common. They're just reality. They're common in the human situation, having these different linguistic styles and formats that are particular to given cultures in their time and in their history and in their own nature. So, anyway, going along, let's move along to verse 31. Now, this one's kind of interesting because he says in verse 31, "And he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other." Now, first thing, we are still in the first century because our marker in verse 34, which is 3 more verses away, Jesus says that all these things will come upon this generation. This generation will not pass away, all right? And that's within this, what we call that inclusio. From Matthew 23 and 36 to Matthew 24:34, there's this inclusio of the whole framework of this generation. And so we're still in that 24:34 framework. And, the question is, what happened on the ground? What does that mean? What was this gathering? Frankly, I'm not sure. And frankly, I don't think anybody is totally sure. The only thing I can stop is ask myself, and I will do this periodically, is that context matters. What do we know? We know that whatever it was occurred in the first century. And the second thing I'd like to suggest to you is I don't believe this is the rapture. Certainly not the future rapture if Jesus is keeping it within the framework of our first century discussion. If it was a rapture, then it happened in the first century. And by the way, there are schools of thought that actually teach and believe that there was a first century rapture. Now, I'm not endorsing that, nor am I condemning it. I'm kind of neutral on it. I think it's a fascinating premise. But I don't believe that idea is taught here in the Olivet Discourse. Now, in order to explain why I don't think it's a rapture of any kind, we need to jump to verse 37. We're going to return to verses 32 to 36 in a moment. But first, I want to look at something that I think dispels the rapture idea completely, whatever time you might think it is. And in verse 37, we read that as were the days of Noah, so will be the coming, the parousia again, of the Son of Man. Now, first, since this verse 37 is past that verse where he said all these things will come upon this generation, this is a verse that occurs after that. It could be construed as something that happens later. Okay, I see that. However, the fact is that we have continuity, and we have continuity because he uses the term parousia. So will be the parousia of the Son of Man. The same parousia that the disciples inquired about, the same parousia that was described as lightning coming from east to west. Okay, and so we still have this ingathering, which is like, or the season which is like the days of Noah, is still in that same time frame. Okay, we get a continuity. This use of parousia in 37 is a connector. Okay, it's not a new parousia. It's the parousia. It's the same one. There's no reason to believe it's anything other. So in verse 27, the lightning that's shining from east to west, or west to east, east to west, is specific to his coming judgment of 70 AD. Then the same language in verse 37 must refer to the same time period. This is from page 173 in the book, by the way. The same coming, the parousia, of the Son of Man is mentioned as follows. Now get this. This is right from the book, as I said, page 173. He says in Matthew 24:27, he said, as the lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will be the parousia, the coming of the Son of Man. And we said that was referring to 70 A.D. For as in the days of Noah, verse 37 says, so will be the coming, the parousia of the Son of Man, which now falls into the same period. Interestingly enough, the Greek text, the original text of Matthew 24:27 and Matthew 24:37 is identical. They both read, if I may, Altos estai kai he parousia to viu to anthropu. That is translated, this will also be the presence of the Son of Man. Also is inserted into the received text, the King James text, and that's why it's mentioned there, the word kai. But the idea is we have identical language establishing that these two events, the lightning coming from the east to the west, are both happening in that time frame of 70 AD. So it isn't a future rapture. Now, why isn't it a rapture at all? Well, we go in verse 37. Let's continue. For the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the parousia of the Son of Man. For as in those days of Noah, before the flood, they were eating, drinking, marrying, and giving in marriage until the day when Noah entered the ark. Verse 39, and they were unaware until the flood came and swept them all away. So will be the coming, the parousia of the Son of Man. Then, tote again, at that time, 2 men will be in the field, one will be taken, one left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill, one will be taken, one left. So the $64,000 question for us is, who's taken and who's left? Well, let's kind of break this down a little bit. Let's unpackage it a little bit. Jesus tells us that the flood came. A flood came just like when Noah entered the ark. What he's talking about is an invasion, a military invasion. We've talked about this briefly before. Isaiah 8:6-8 talks about the flood, of the invading Assyrians. We see the same imagery in Isaiah 17:12. Daniel 26 is very specific. 9:26 tells us that the sanctuary's end will come with a flood. And there's a direct reference to this. So what he's talking about is an invasion. So the invasion comes in verse 39. They were unaware until an invasion came to sweep them all away. This is what the parousia will be like. Now, let me add, this has nothing to do with giants coming at the end of the world. Some people get into this big, drastic thing about giants coming and all these apocalyptic things happening at the end of the world. Jesus said nothing about giants or angel marriages or giant witches or any kind of nonsense like that. He's simply using the illustration or the allusion to a flood that swept away the wicked, and Noah was preserved in the ark. Now watch the language. One will be taken, one will be left. Genesis 7:23 says that in the flood, he blotted out every living thing. They were blotted out from the earth. Only Noah was left and those who were with him in the ark. Who was left? Noah. Who was taken? The wicked. The whole idea of someone being taken and one left is someone being swept away by this invasion, killed, destroyed, exiled, however you want to see that. Those left were the saints. They were not destroyed in the flood, and this is borne out. And we actually even saw this last time when we looked at Zechariah. If I can go to that again very quickly, in Zechariah 14, which we went through all the references to on that day this would happen, and on that day is all these references to the destruction of Jerusalem, and in 70 AD about the city being destroyed and the Lord becoming king on that day and all this. And then in verse 16 it says, then everyone who survives of all the nations that have come against Jerusalem year after year will come and worship the king. And he's talking about that in some translations say, and it shall be everyone who is left, okay, who is left after all these events shall go up from year to year to worship. Now, so what we have is the point that this who's taken, who's left, it's the wicked who are taken in judgment, who are swept away by the judgment of the flood, by the invasion of the Roman army, and the saints who of God, of followers of Jesus, will preserved, and they remain, okay? And, Jesus goes on to say, just like in Noah's day, that they were eating and drinking, we're told in verse 38, that they were eating, drinking, marrying, giving in marriage until the day when Noah entered the ark. And then they were unaware until the flood came and swept them all away. Now, there's two possible references here. The first one could be the fact that they were just carrying on life as normal. Of course, there was zealot activity and zealot resistance going on during that time. But at the same time, the most average person had no idea what was going on when Nero issued the order for Vespasian to invade Jerusalem. He released the troops of Vespasian, and they began bringing destruction upon the cities of Israel. And there's a second possibility here too, and which I'm inclined to believe, was that in the year 69 AD, which we briefly discussed earlier, that there was a suspension of the war at the death of Nero as three successive additional emperors tried to take control of the empire, and Vespasian suspended the war effort, and the Jews came to a point of kind of relaxing and thinking this thing was, maybe over, and they went to the city to celebrate the Passover, and they went on carrying on their lives over the course of that year. And guess what happened? Vespasian is made emperor, and he assigns his son General Titus to go and continue and prosecute the war. And boom, they're shut up in the city, and what happens? The Romans invade the city and sweep all of them away in fire and judgment and death and destruction, and over 1 million people in the city, as well as over 100,000 that were exiled. And so we have all of this contained in Jesus' description. Now back to the original question, and we're going to finish here because we're running a little long. I don't think anyone's for sure what happened on the ground when we ask, that he gathered his elect. Some suggest that it has to do with the church being gathered out of Jerusalem and to safety in Pella, which we've talked about that they've done. Some have suggested that this is the worldwide release of the gospel, that now that the messengers are not angels, but that they're people, the apostles, and they, being now finally released from the clutches of Judaism, were able to go forward and bring the gospel to the whole world. That's not a bad idea. I'm not real in favor with it. I think it has something to do personally with the true return from captivity. The saints will now come to a place where they are no longer connected to Judaism, and especially the elect of the Jews being gathered from their Judaistic roots and being brought to Zion, the heavenly Jerusalem, where they are now freed from captivity. And even the rabbis anticipated that the true release from captivity was not just what happened to Babylon, but that they were still under Roman hegemony, Roman rule, and so there was still a release from captivity that they were anticipating, a spiritual release. And maybe we'll review this quickly in our next session because we've kind of run out of time, but and then we'll get back to verses 32 to 36. So hey, listen, thanks for tuning in. God bless you. And I hope you got something out of this. And please feel free to hit that like button or shoot me a note or a text or go to the website, pick up a copy of the book. Thanks a lot. Love you guys. And God bless you.